Hi. So since the last video I touched briefly on the subject of enlightenment or bodhi, I figured I'd actually make a video on the subject specifically. So I first discovered the concept when I was 15 back in late 2008 when our family was given a copy of the book The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle. And I found it quite interesting because maybe in part because it didn't really seem to have any kind of weirdness or silliness to it. It was just an inner experience, so as a result, it wasn't like he was, doing any weird magical things or anything. It was just an experience that he recounted about finding this enlightenment that, brought him peace. And I thought, like, this sounds like something really good, and it seemed quite plausible. And so as a result, over the years, I delved into the subject a bit more, although not all that much. Like, I never even bought any books on the subject at all. I just, read a few things on the internet. And basically, pretty quickly, I ended up just quite fully, getting on board with the concept. And even now, I don't really think that there's much evidence against it. In any case, it's just a subjective experience. So, even if it isn't true, well, who cares? I mean, these people are certainly, they might be lying about feeling it, but I really don't imagine so. So, what does it even mean, So they're just feeling this experience. And it seems like it's a nice experience and a desirable one. And as a result, I find it, something that people should strive for. So what is this enlightenment thing? It kind of depends who you ask. Because you see, basically, some people see it as oneness, as a sort of feeling of oneness with all of existence, and other people will see it more like emptiness, where, instead of there being you're one with everything, well, actually, it's more like there's nothing at all. And so basically, the oneness is more of the typical Indian approach, which kind of associates also the god Brahman with the concept of oneness. And so the oneness concept is more the typically, Hindu, and just more generally, most, Indian religions are more about the oneness and experiencing, like what they would call, God in a sort of impersonal sense. And on the other hand, well, Buddhism is about the noneness rather than the oneness, right? It's about emptiness and nothingness. And so overall, my impression is that Buddhism actually is more advanced and actually get things right, and basically the other religions are kind of stuck at, a sort of intermediate stage, basically. And I'm saying that, so first we have to I think it's useful to explore the core concepts of Buddhism. So already, one of the fundamental concepts of Buddhism is the Four Noble Truths. So the Four Noble Truths is 1, there is suffering. 2, the cause of suffering is basically not being enlightened, so basically not being aware of the sort of emptiness of everything, and including, crucially, the emptiness of the self, and basically as a result, you identify with this idea of a personal self and as it being something really substantial, when in fact it actually is fundamentally empty. And so that leads to suffering because you're attached to this. And so then, of course, so that brings us to the noble truth number 3, which is that the end to suffering, well, is enlightenment, which is, bodhi, which is the understanding that everything is empty and that there is nothing really real and tangible, and that everything is a bit illusory, and that includes the self. So if something bad happens to you, well, it doesn't really matter because you doesn't really exist. And then the 4th noble truth is how to reach this state of bodhi or enlightenment. And so what he says is that it's mostly through meditation, although that can take lots of different forms. So by and large, these 4 noble truths seems, I like the way it's done. It's very structured and methodical. It seems, overall, I just very much like the sort of, the style of the teachings attributed to Siddhartha, who's Siddhartha Gautama, who was the Buddha, right? And I like it because he's very analytical, very, some would call it autistic, in the way he says stuff in a very sort of simplified, rigorous fashion, which I actually very much like myself, and I'm sort of trying to emulate that as well. And so I like the way that this 4 noble truths are really conceptualized. I like the fundamentally utilitarian mindset behind the Four Noble Truths, is that basically, just like utilitarianism, it recognizes that the real problem is suffering, and that we just must minimize suffering as much as possible. So really, it is already a form of utilitarianism, which was quite unique for the time because basically, usually, ethics was related to being like respectful to authority and to the gods and all that kind of thing. It wasn't about minimizing suffering. So I think it's awesome that somebody already like 2,500 years ago in largely backward societies managed to come up with a rational system of ethics. And so do I actually agree with these Four Noble Truths? Largely yes, although I think it's a bit too simple. Like, obviously, I can't really know for sure if enlightenment is true or not, because I haven't experienced it myself. I'm willing to believe that a person who's fully enlightened doesn't suffer at all. Although, again, I can't really know for sure, and my guess is that they probably still suffer a little bit, because when you look at, like, the behaviors of the people who claim to be enlightened, well, they still do things in, like, pretty self-serving ways. Like, if you look at the people who claim to be enlightened, well, their actions are still pretty self-serving. So my guess is that they do still suffer a little bit, but just much, much less. And that brings me also to the fact that nowadays there are lots of people claiming to be enlightened, but many of them are not in the Buddhist sense of the emptiness, but more in the other religion sense of the oneness. And lots of these people don't really claim to belong to any like movement or religion in particular. And what you'll notice is that typically these people didn't even do all that much meditation to achieve their enlightenment. In fact, as far as I can tell, like the people who do lots of meditation are almost never enlightened, and the people who are enlightened usually didn't do all that much meditation. And so as a result, I get the impression that rule number 4 is actually, the Noble Truth number 4 is not actually that true. I think that meditation is actually not really quite what is going to get you to enlightenment. And I think the idea that, all suffering is caused by unenlightenment, well, in a way it tends to maybe negate all the external causes that might, make you suffering from an external perspective. If your country's like at war and you're poor and starving and whatever, well, those are external causes of suffering. And the problem is if you see everything through a lens of unenlightenment, so sure, you could say, okay, if you're enlightened, well, that wouldn't make you suffer. Sure, but shouldn't we maybe still try to address, like, these external causes of suffering? Because I get the impression that often, like, this idea about suffering coming from within then can lead people to be a bit too complacent about, the problems that exist in the actual external material world. And that is something that I take issue with, even though I don't actually disagree with enlightenment being, like, a very important objective for people to attain. And so then you have this idea of, like, the 3 fundamental characteristics or something along those lines. And so one of them is suffering. Another one is emptiness, and especially emptiness of the self, so no self. And the third is impermanence, so, like, nothing stays the same, everything's always changing. And those are pretty obvious truths as well. I mean, we know that people suffer. I think it's also quite obvious that the self is a sort of self-created construct. I mean, I don't really find that hard to believe. I mean, obviously, when you think about it, you realize that it's an illusion. Like, it's just a feeling that's created by your mental processes, but that are ultimately impersonal, right? Like, fundamentally, it's just, like, nerve cells doing stuff, and of course, it's just a feeling that arises, but from an ultimately impersonal source. And impermanence, well, yeah, that's obvious. We know that things are always changing, and you can't stop it, and that's just how things are. Like, literally, I mean, if things didn't change, we couldn't even have time. That's why I said in the previous video, like, you need things to change over time for existence to be, because if everything always is the same, well, you can't even have your own thought processes, because thinking requires change over time, it requires changes in your brain, very rapid changes in your brain for you to think at all. So obviously those things are true. And then, as I explained, there's also this concept of dependent origination, which is that basically the things that exist kind of depend on each other to exist, which means that they don't have any fundamental existence of their own, you see. Like, they only arise because of other things. Like, all these things only arise because of the existence of other things, so no thing actually has its own inherent existence independently of anything else. So that kind of can help you grasp this concept of nothingness. And so one of the reasons I think that Buddhism is more advanced is because actually in Buddhism you have this idea of, like, levels of pre-enlightenment, and so that's called stream entry. And so you've got these various levels where you sort of already have significant changes in your outlook, but you're not quite fully aware of this real emptiness. And what you realize is that actually the first level of, pre-enlightenment seems to correspond pretty well to the Enlightenment of other religions. Because there's this idea of, feeling connection, and also this idea of intense joy, and that's actually characteristic of the first level. And then you realize that that too is actually a bit empty, because it's still just a feeling, and that basically it's not really real. And it's true that also just from a very, rational, conceptual point of view, since obviously I'm not feeling these things, but just from my own analytical perspective, well, this idea of telling myself, well, I am one with everything, well, no, I'm not one with everything, I mean, if I was really one with everything, then I would, be able to feel everything that's going on everywhere in the universe, and that, we know that that's not the case, even for enlightened people, right? They still just remain people. So obviously that is kind of weird, this sort of this oneness that I kept reading about. There's something a bit disturbing about it. I'd never really thought about it quite consciously, but I was like, this is a bit weird, really. And meanwhile, this emptiness notion is much more appealing to the rational mind, because there you can actually say, well, yes, things are ultimately empty. We know that atoms are just made of subatomic particles who themselves don't even have any volume, right? They're just points, so they're not even anything at all. They don't really even exist. And likewise, all of existence depends on things like space and time, who don't really exist, because they're just a sort of a theoretical structure that allow things to exist. And then I was thinking, even if these subatomic particles did have a volume, well, fundamentally, for them to, exist and be observable, they have to interact with other particles, right? Like matter. If I put my hand on the bed here and I feel the bed, and I can't put my hand further down because the bed here that I'm sitting on, because I'm sitting on my bed, is solid. Like I say, it's solid. It's because, not just because there's a volume, but because there are actual forces that keep, the whole thing together, right? It's these different, the weak and strong nuclear forces, and then the electromagnetic forces that are just, keeping the whole thing together. If you didn't have these forces, not only would I just be able to put my hand right through the bed, I wouldn't be able to see the bed, I wouldn't be able to perceive the bed in any way. It would be just kind of like the issue of dark matter, right? But dark matter, of course, we're aware of it because it still has one force and dark matter, of course, we're aware of it because of one force, which is that of gravity. So if dark matter didn't even have gravity as a force, well, we really couldn't be aware of it at all. So the idea is that for anything to exist, it actually has to depend on a force. And this force is basically just a manifestation of its interaction with other particles. A force is basically just saying, well, this particle has an effect on another particle. There's one atom of the bed here that's attached to another atom on the bed, and together, their interactions of all these atoms together make the fact that I can actually see the bed. See, if these atoms didn't have any kind of force, which means that they didn't have any interaction between each other, if they just existed completely independently from one another, then they couldn't stick together. And the sticking together is what allows them to form a bed, and more generally, the fact that they have a force is what allows me to observe them, because I can interact with them. For instance, physically, I can interact because I'm also made of, these particles, and the particles of my own body are interacting with these other particles, both, for instance, through touch, and for instance, through sight. I can see it because there's a particle that's bouncing off the bed, photon bouncing off the bed, and then going into my eye, and then activating a whole circuitry that ends up in me perceiving the bed. And so what I mean is that without interaction, you wouldn't be able to have any of that. The photon would just go right through the bed, and even if we suppose that bounced back through the bed, if it didn't manage to interact with my retina, then I wouldn't be able to perceive it. So what I mean is that for anything to be perceptible, well, we need to have interactions. See, if the photon didn't actually interact with anything else in any way, it wouldn't actually exist. How can you say something exists if it actually interacts with nothing at all? You can't, because you have no way of finding out its existence. Everything that we perceive depends on interaction for it to be perceived and to exist as a material object, or or even just as something that's not even quite material, like dark matter, which we don't even know really what it is, or we don't even know if it really exists, or if it's just the best theory we have so far to explain things. And I think that's a great way of illustrating the ultimate empty nature of everything, is that fundamentally, things can only exist by interacting with other things. No thing can exist on its own. And that's why I find this Buddhist concept of emptiness very intellectually appealing, even independently of any subjective feeling of enlightenment. But since we've been reading all these accounts about enlightenment, and about how it seems to represent a more true and healthy way of seeing things, I've come to the conclusion that it actually genuinely is the best way of intuitively perceiving things, and now I've come to consider enlightenment to simply represent genuine mental health. For me, enlightenment is actually mental health. It's like the absence of mental diseases, the absence of neurosis and psychosis, although it's more the absence of that at an emotional and intellectual level. The way I see it, is that rationality is the opposite of psychosis, because psychosis is fundamentally craziness, and in the sense of not seeing things rationally, not seeing things the way that they are, and that you should be able to see them with a rational mind. And so to me, the opposite of psychosis isn't so much enlightenment as it's rational thinking. But you could also say that enlightenment is about seeing things the way they really are at an intuitive level, and psychosis, well, is seeing things as they aren't. So, in a way, you could also make a case that on another level, enlightenment is also the opposite of psychosis. And because enlightenment then also, by enabling you to see the emptiness of your own self, makes you no longer attached to the idea of yourself and to your own happiness, therefore you can actually accept all the bad things that happen to you and all the pain that happens to you, and therefore you don't experience any suffering anymore. And as a result, that also means that you won't really be experiencing any neurosis anymore. So neurosis are, psychological problems which don't involve a false understanding of reality, but simply more emotional problems that make you suffer. And as such, that's why I consider enlightenment to represent genuine mental health. And I consider sorely incomplete all the interpretations of mental health that don't prominently feature enlightenment. And so now the question is how to achieve this enlightenment, because like I've said, meditation actually doesn't seem to be all that great. Well, if you actually read the accounts of the people who become enlightened, they tend to recommend the approach of actually just asking yourself a single question, which is, what am I, or who am I? And you ask yourself that, and if your mind is already kind of primed for it, if you're already sufficiently, aware, so to speak, and you have a sufficient depth of perception, then suddenly you get this amazing intuitive answer, which is, I am everything. There's no more any distinction between the subject and the object, between the observer and the observed, so that literally everything that you perceive, and like the entire universe, suddenly feels as if it's you. And that feeling is often expressed with the words, I am that. And that refers to everything. It's not really something that you should force, as far as I can tell. It's really just, when your mind is ready for it, you ask yourself, what am I? And suddenly, poof, you'll suddenly experience it. But that actually only gets you to stage 1, what the Buddhists called, the stage 1 of stream entry. So how do you get then to the next levels? Well, I've actually found a pretty good guide on internet by somebody who apparently went through all these levels, and who explains what you should do at each level to reach the next one. Of course, this is only really important for the people who've already reached the first level. For the people who haven't reached that level, for now, the only thing you have to do is reach the first level. And so, of course, well, I said your mind already has to be kind of primed for enlightenment. It has to be ripe. Because, of course, the average person just asking itself, who am I, is not going to become enlightened, right? And I think that's like the fundamental issue that all these people that cover enlightenment fail to address. They always focus on this idea of who am I, and just how it feels like to be enlightened, right? They tell you how they see things from their own enlightened perspective. But how is that actually going to benefit me personally? Because chances are, I personally won't have the right kind of mental clarity that's already required for becoming enlightened. And so, okay, if you look at Buddhism, it tells you meditate. But then we see all these people that meditate, and they still don't become enlightened. So, okay, maybe you could think, okay, if you meditate and then combine it with ask yourself, who am I, after you've meditated for a long time, then that might help. but I'm not all that sure that it really helps all that much. And that's just from a personal perspective, because I've tried to meditate and it just never worked. I mean, I've tried all these, like this concentration meditation, this insight meditation, so like concentration where you like focus on one thing, and it never works because like I always have all these like thoughts that come up and everything, and I actually never manage to concentrate on anything. And then there's like insight where it's precisely about like trying to see things like in them as if you already were enlightened. So you try to like perceive the emptiness of all things already. But it's not really useful if you're just doing it from an intellectual perspective. Then you have like mindfulness meditation, where it's just about like, okay, like I'm aware of these things, it's just about focusing on your environment, on your sensations, and you go wash your hands and you really just focus on like the water flowing on your hands and all that kind of thing. So you don't necessarily even have to do it as like a formal sitting meditation or anything. You can just do it in your day-to-day life. And then of course, there's always this issue of the thoughts that come up, right? So then you also have this form of meditation where you're just supposed to like observe your thoughts, and you just like observe them and then let them fall away. And so that's another kind of technique. And that never worked for me, because what happens is that if I tried to observe the thoughts, then my thoughts actually wouldn't even come up and they'd stop flowing, and I'd just become like totally mentally rigid. And that's also what would happen like with concentration meditation and mindfulness meditation and pretty much every kind of meditation, is that I basically always would end up kind of winding my mind up really hard, and it was like not enjoyable and not useful, and I didn't feel like any progress at all was being made, and I'm sure there wasn't indeed any progress that was being made. And in fact, it just made me worse. Like all my attempts at meditation, no matter what I did, and I did lots of sort of these different techniques, even though I didn't do it for very long times or very often, because I could tell that it wasn't really helping me. But I did a lot of them, and I could tell that pretty much no meditation technique was helping me. They were actually making me worse. And so that's why I've actually come to the conclusion that you shouldn't meditate. At least people like me shouldn't meditate. So that's perhaps another problem, is that just like in medicine, we tend to have a sort of one-size-fits-all approach to everyone. Probably for this kind of thing, there's also too much of a one-size-fits-all approach. And in fact, probably each individual will benefit from a particular tailored approach, which of course will be very difficult to ascertain, so which is why I think it's important for people to try lots of different approaches and see what works. And so for me, what I think actually should have worked, and basically I've only come to realize this extremely recently, and now I'm sort of kicking myself for it for not having come up with it earlier, is like literally do nothing. But like there's this idea, so that's the sort of do nothing meditation, which is quite common in the sort of Zen meditation especially, where there's just like this idea where you just sit and do nothing, which is called like shikantaza. But even there, the problem is that it's still too much of meditation, because you're like still sitting formally, and it's actually quite tiring just to maintain the position. And then like even if you have thoughts, you're still often supposedly supposed to observe them, and from my experience, if I do that, I just get myself completely wound up and like the complete opposite of what you'd want. And as a result, what I've come up with is that you actually shouldn't even do that. You should do even more of a do-nothing. So what is the least doing thing that one can do? Well, it's not sitting already, it's lying down. So my advice is actually you just go lie down, you turn off the light so that you're in the dark, because that way you have even less stimulation, and you just lie comfortably. You don't lie like straight or anything like a plant, you lie exactly in the way that makes you feel the most comfortable, and just do nothing exactly in the same way that you do before going to sleep. You don't try to like follow your thoughts or anything, you just let your thoughts happen, and you don't try even to observe them. You just let the whole, what they call the monkey mind thing. Not only do you not try to fight the monkey mind, you don't even try to observe it. You don't do anything different from going to sleep. So it's an anti-meditation. It's an absolute non-meditation. But what it does is that relaxes your body. And I think our bodies are overstimulated. And much of the reason that we can't achieve enlightenment is because we're tiring our bodies out. And, the whole sort of mind-body continuum. And so that is actually what I've come up with. You should simply spend several hours, like just as much time as you can, every day, doing literally nothing. Just lying in bed as if you're trying to sleep, except you won't sleep because it's not your time to go to sleep. but you just do the same thing and you just don't do anything. And then, of course, you shouldn't actually expect any big changes. See, when you start meditating, very quickly, typically, you'll notice changes. You'll notice changes just after like one meditation session. At least, just after it, you'll likely notice that you feel different. With this lying in bed thing, you won't. But that actually should be seen as a good thing, right? Because it's more of a long-term process. You can't expect to just be enlightened right away. You're forcing it. The way I see it, enlightenment is kind of like emotions, right? Like, you can't force an emotion. You can't say, okay, now I'm feeling happy. No, you can't do that. Happiness is something that you sort of has to come, and just maybe it will come, maybe it won't, and you shouldn't ever force it. And, well, of course, happiness in any case is not something that's meant to last, unlike enlightenment, which then is supposed to just last for the rest of your life and be permanent. But in the same way that you shouldn't force an emotion, I think you shouldn't force enlightenment, and that includes even through meditation. And so instead what you should do is simply allow your body and mind to be the most both strong and relaxed as possible, so as to allow yourself to be receptive when you finally ask yourself this question, who am I? Which then, well, should trigger enlightenment, stage 1 of enlightenment, if you're actually ready for it. And so more generally, of course, you just need to reach that stage, you need to have a healthy diet, because again, it's about making your body healthier. You need to, as much as possible, make yourself, feel well. So I think an important thing is to have healthy relationships with people. So, if you have unhealthy relationships, well, you either try to improve them or just break the relationship entirely. And this is another thing that I personally experienced, is actually physical exercise is not actually good for people like me who have bodies who are actually pretty weak and who get overly tired very quickly. I've noticed that basically I always do worse when I do any kind of even moderately intense physical exercise on a regular basis, or even just on a short basis. Like, I've actually noticed that exercise is deleterious for my well-being and, for any kind of progress in the direction of enlightenment. And in fact, well, you notice all these sort of monks and stuff that try to go for enlightenment, well, they don't work out much or don't do all that much physical activity. So okay, these Zen people were actually, they would do gardening work and stuff like that. I would say that for many people that kind of work is good, so moderate physical activity, just going hiking and that kind of thing. That is healthy, but then for some people like me who really have frail bodies that are very quickly prone to exhaustion, it's better just to not even do that and just literally just be a couch potato. I know this can sound weird. I know that it goes against the health advice that is being accumulated by medical advice, but what you have to understand is that it's very hard to have hard evidence for any kind of long-term health advice like this. Sure, there are correlations between exercising a lot and being healthy, but mostly what they're measuring is not actual people's health. If they follow people who exercise a lot and say they're healthier, it's not so much because they've taken one group and had them not exercise their whole life and take another group and have them exercise their whole life and see that those who exercise are healthier. It's not like that. It's rather that there are markers of health that are higher in people who exercise more. But of course, in part, there could be a correlation with, eating properly or doing other healthy habits. It's very hard to tease out the truth behind this. And from my own empirical evidence, I just noticed that exercise is not the way to go. And I think it's probably the case for a sizable proportion of the population, though not everyone. I think certain people definitely do benefit from moderate physical activity. And I think there are not many people at all that benefit from really intense physical activity, but I'm not even entirely sure about that. Because if you look at the actual medical studies, you'll see that people do improve. But I wonder if those are more short-term improvements in health markers rather than actually long-term health. For now, I haven't really found anything conclusive about this. So again, I can't tell you this for sure. I'm just saying, for me, I'm definitely better off when I exercise less. And then, well, there's eating, and so there's healthy eating. So I'll cover again a bit this exercise issue and, just more generally activity issue, as well as eating in another post. And That way we'll have a sort of comprehensive overview of the whole thing. But for now, that's the idea, is basically first you have to prime yourself for enlightenment, which is to let your body recover and get both more strong and more relaxed by eating well, for one, then by relaxing a lot, so not doing exercise and even just staying in bed a lot, and then thirdly, just doing activities that sort of make you well, and in particular, like in terms of socialization, to have healthy social environments. And of course that, like, if you have a job, well, if you can quit your job, you probably should quit your job. And if, you have to work, well, you should try to find the job that best suits you and that makes you the most happy, and also the one that's just the least of a burden on you, the one that basically you should just work the least as possible. Again, this may not be true for everyone. This is in particular true for people like me who are particularly, susceptible to being overloaded by activity. So that's how you get your body and mind primed to be receptive to this who am I thing, which you can then, once you're ready, think about and hopefully manage to attain stage 1 of enlightenment through that. And so then, once you reach that, well, I'm going to show you just the website where I found these stages of enlightenment, and that way, well, if you've already reached stage 1 of pre-enlightenment, you can see what you have to do next. Okay, so here this is Awakening to Reality. This is actually not the first place where I saw it posted. I saw it posted first on another site, but I can't remember what it's called. So anyway, this is where this person, Thusness Passerby, 7 Stages of Enlightenment, posted this thing. So I think this is really the best conceptualization of, the different stages of enlightenment that I've managed to find. And so basically, I'm not going to cover the whole thing, because in any case, it doesn't mean, to me, it means nothing. Like, I haven't even gotten close to stage 1. So this will be, useful for people who actually have already reached stage 1. So I'll just, briefly cover stage 1, the experience of I am. Then stage 2, the experience of I am everything. 3, entering into a state of nothingness. 4, presence as mirror-bright clarity. 5, no mirror reflecting. 6, the nature of presence is empty. 7, presence is spontaneously perfected. And one thing that was interesting is that I remembered on the other site where I first saw this, and for some reason now I don't know what happened to it, but there's this idea that at stage 7, he says you actually just keep on progressing. Like, stage 7 is not even the final stage. It's more like it remains a process, and you keep on refining your degree of enlightenment even at stage 7. And as a result, well, it means that you never have perfect enlightenment, see? So, like I was saying there's pre-enlightenment and then full enlightenment, but actually, from what this person says at least, it seems like there never is perfect enlightenment, and that you can always just keep progressing in enlightenment, which also means that you never reach perfection, which also means that you never completely stop suffering. And I think as a result, it's also important to understand that, your life is still worth living even if you're not enlightened. I often get the impression, because I sort of thought of this myself too, is if enlightenment is just so incredibly important to, living the way you're supposed to, then everything that happens until your enlightenment isn't even worthwhile. And I think that's really a big mistake. You should already just appreciate where you are at right now, even if you're not enlightened. And this becomes especially more apparent when you realize that in any case, you're never going to be perfectly enlightened. And another thing I'd just like to add is that, of course, this concept of enlightenment is associated with quite a few religions that mostly originated in Greater India. That does not mean that I belong to any of those religions or support any of those religions. So, like I said, Buddhism is the religion that basically best explains all of this. I still oppose all religion, including Buddhism. And that's because, Buddhism is not just those basic concepts I've told you about. Buddhism also involves, a whole big cosmology involving, all sorts of, weird sort of semi-divinities and stuff, and, weird supernatural realms and things. And there really isn't any good evidence for that. And so, Buddhism taken as a whole is not really a credible religion. These core concepts around the sort of, emptiness of all things and enlightenment and all that, those I believe in, and those I believe are just, real good rational concepts that actually help people attain mental health. But then all the sort of everything else that got built around it is not actually healthy. It's not good, it's not helpful, and it's just not true. And like all religions, it's led to all sorts of persecution of people, whether, for instance, people of other religions, or of persecution of people of their own community. I mean, like, Tibet, before it got incorporated into China, was a feudal society with, like, most people being just practically the slaves of a few lords, like, just as was the case in medieval Europe. Like, China is definitely oppressing Tibetans in horrible ways, but, like, the original Tibetan culture was oppressing its own people almost as much, okay? This is something that's not necessarily talked about very much, but it's important to bear in mind. And meanwhile, of course, we have these attacks on, Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar, and attacks on Malay Muslims in Thailand. So, like, just because a religion has some correct core concepts doesn't mean that it's actually correct as a whole, and it doesn't mean that it's going to necessarily be, like, good in all circumstances. All religions are irrational, and I oppose all of them, and we should really just strive to abandon all religions. And so basically, as we can see, Buddhism is both, like, intolerant of other religions, and it also typically has a very strong hierarchy that gets imposed within both the general Buddhist society and also specifically within, like, the more religious monastic environment. On the other hand, there is one movement that I'm really pretty admirative of, and that is Zen Buddhism. And that's because precisely, well, they kind of ditch all the religious aspect of Buddhism and really focus just on enlightenment. It's really just became like a sort of movement to just get people to become enlightened. And that is amazing. And they did that for like a whole millennium, basically. From the moment that, like, Bodhidharma came to China and introduced Buddhism to China and founded Zen Buddhism. And then that, got perpetuated for a very, very long time, and then got exported over to Japan pretty quickly. And for many centuries, this was actually happening. You had these communities where the monks would actually apparently get enlightened. And then a few centuries back, what happened is that suddenly that stopped happening. Suddenly people, well, they stopped becoming enlightened, because suddenly you no longer hear any stories about such and such a person becoming enlightened. And so it just became suddenly sterile. Like, it's as if because people stopped believing that could happen, it actually stopped happening. And the result nowadays, Zen Buddhism is dead. It exists still as a movement, but nobody's actually becoming enlightened from it. And that's unfortunate, because for the time it was actually alive and making people become enlightened, well, it was the only, like, religious-like movement, or just movement of any kind, that persisted for a long duration, and that was kind of formal and codified, that actually managed to get people enlightened, and that didn't suffer from too much of religious dogma. It was really focused on getting people enlightenment, and actually apparently succeeded. And that is absolutely remarkable. But in a way, Zen Buddhism wasn't even really a religion, right? It was more like a discipline. So in a way, what I think would be good would be to sort of just revive the spirit of actually believing that we can become enlightened, and do so from a completely non-religious perspective, just by recognizing that it's genuine mental health, and that's just a genuinely correct way of seeing the world. And if we can do that, then we'll finally, be promoting mental health and make people actually finally be able to experience life as it should be. Because as far as I can tell, enlightenment just allows you to really experience life in a much more true and genuine and just more intense, authentic, all these words, whatever, but, in a much better fashion, to really just fully enjoy life. And that's the way I see it, like, all these religions, for them it's about, escaping from the cycle of rebirth and stuff, but we don't know if that actually is how it works, right? They say that you should, because there's this idea that you get continually reincarnated, and in fact that is a result of you're being unenlightened, and as a result, you're suffering. So if you want to stop suffering, you become enlightened, and as a result of that, you will also stop reincarnating, or at least stop being forcefully reincarnated. And again, we don't have any evidence for that, so I don't really think that that is the perspective that you should be going from. The reason you should go for enlightenment is just because it will allow you to experience life more fully. And so hopefully, well, if more people manage to become enlightened, they actually will be able to just lead more fulfilling lives. And that is really the whole purpose of enlightenment.